A very good morning to everyone and welcome to our second webinar under the 50 Years of New Economic Policy at IDEAS. My name is Vaishnavi Rao and I will be your MC for today. Thank you very much for spending your Thursday morning with us as we launch the second paper under this project, 50 Years of New Economic Policy, Revisiting its Impact on Social Cohesion, National Unity and the Creation of Bangsa Malaysia. So just a little housekeeping as we get started. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please type them into the Q&A box. Our moderator for the day, Shin, will bring them up during the panel discussion. We will also have time for questions at the end. So today we will begin our webinar with some welcoming remarks from IDEA's CEO, Trisha Yeo. Trisha was unfortunately not able to join us today, so we will be playing a pre-recorded welcoming message for her.
A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media and friends. Thank you so much for being with us on day 2 of our 3-day series of webinars in which we launched 3 very important and crucial policy papers that we hope will inject debate into the policy of affirmative action and the NEP in Malaysia. As I mentioned yesterday, in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of Malaysia's new economic policy, IDEAS embarked on this advocacy project with the aim of revisiting and re-examining our successes and shortcomings of the policy. And the paper yesterday, we had an invigorating discussion, was by Dr. Lee Hock An, looking at NEP Beyond 50, What Lies Ahead. Today, we are witnessing the launch of Professor Dr. Abdul Rahman Embong's paper titled 50 Years of the New Economic Policy, Revisiting its Impact on Social Cohesion, National Unity and the Creation of Bangsa Malaysia, which we have heard of today. Perhaps the more relevant phrase would be Keluarga Malaysia. Professor Rahman's paper examines the context in which the new economic policy emerged and how the NEP's overriding objective was very much linked to the national question, namely the building of a united and cohesive Bangsa Malaysia. He highlights how the notion of Bangsa Malaysia, or a Malaysian nation, is defined by leaders or those with authority. And at the same time, the intricacies of the idea of nation concerns how people interpret their histories, their experiences, and social memories of being together, their interpretation of treatment meted out by the state and its apparatuses, whether perceived or real, and how the people of various ethnic groups rally in solidarity and support of each other, especially in times of adversity, which we've seen very much this year as a result of the pandemic. Or conversely, ignore these groups in need of empathy and solace. We hope that through this paper, IDEAS is able to facilitate an honest and open conversation about the idea of Malaysian nationhood that is rightfully complex and subjective to everyone's experiences of this country. It is becoming even more important than ever that we think about social cohesion and national unity in our relatively fragile and frail state. We do hope that the paper will spark discussion and we will have an important conversation about national unity and interracial harmony, a subject that IDEAS cares very deeply about and has done a lot of work on. So do check out our website. Once again, thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow in our final installation of this webinar series, where we are launching the final paper, Professor Wan Zawawi's paper on the impact of the NEP on the Orang Asli and indigenous people in Malaysia. All very important topics, and thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you to Trisha for that warm welcome. I will now pass the floor to Prof. Rahman Embong. Just some quick introductions for Prof. Rahman Embong before I pass the floor. Prof. Dato Dr. Abdul Rahman Embong is a development sociologist who received his bachelor's from the University of Leicester. He received his master's from the School of Oriental and African Studies and his PhD from the University of Malaya. He has been a fellow at IKMAS for more than 2 decades before retiring from UKM and IKMAS in 2018. He was conferred Emeritus Professor in Sociology of Development by UKM and was also a professor and principal researcher. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you, Vaishnavi. I have to share screen now, right? Just a minute, I'm sharing my screen. Okay, thank you, Vaishnavi. Good morning to everyone, especially to Shin, who will be the moderator, to Professor James Shin, an old friend, who will be one of the panelists, and to Netusha, and to all participants. I'm glad to be able to participate in this webinar as part of the IDS project in producing 3 policy papers, as was mentioned by Tisha Yu just now. My presentation for today will be on 50 years of the NEP, revisiting its impacts on national unity, on social cohesion, national unity, and the creation of Bangsa Malaysia. Now, before I proceed, I just would like to say that my focus is solely on the on social cohesion, national unity, and the creation of Bangsa Malaysia, without touching on the NEP's economic dimensions and debates, because this is a topic for paper 1, and nor will I touch on the impact of NEP on the indigenous communities, the Orang Asli and the indigenous groups in Sabah and Sarawak, because this is a topic of policy paper 3. Now, the rough outline of my paper will be the 4 themes I will take up. First is the twin challenge and the NEP package at the time of independence and right up to 1970s. And then I will discuss social cohesion and nationality over 5 decades. And then the narrative of Bangsa Malaysia as part of nation building, and the conclusion will be some reflections on where to go from here, especially on Bangsa Malaysia. And most of what I'm presenting, 90% are from the paper, but towards the end, in the conclusion, there are a few ideas that come after the paper. Now, I'll first talk about the twin challenge at the time of independence that should be addressed together. Challenge 1 was the national question. That is, the problem was that at independence, our country inherited a state from the British, but without a nation. And nation building thus became a central issue. Why was there no nation? That is a very important question. Well, partly because of the British colonial machinations and the suppression of the champions of nationhood at that time. But though there was a state without a nation at independence, it does not mean that there were no conceptions of a nation during the struggle for independence. Now, just to highlight here in this seminar, that at least there were 2 conceptions of the nation prior to independence. One was mooted by Putra AMCJA, which was jointly chaired by Dr. Burhanuddin Al-Helmi and Tan Cheng Lock. And in their 10-point People's Constitutional proposals, the nation that they proposed was Melayu. The term used was Melayu, but it was based on patriotism, not on ethnic origin or blood. It is the conception of the nation from below, not hoisted from the top. Now, it was a nation of intent, but what happened was that in 1948, Putra AMCJA and the people, as the organizations affiliated with them, the leaders and the people the members and so on were all, the organizations were banned, leaders and members were arrested and detained, some escaped, etc. So because of that, the champion of that nation, concept of the nation, could not operate. Now, the second notion of the nation was advocated by the Communities Liaison Committee, or the CLC, which was formed after the banning of Putra MCAGA, and the people, it was proposed by Malcolm McDonald, and the key people inside there were Dato, Isi Twaisingham, Tan Chen Lok, and a few others. Now, CLC proposed the concept of Malayan nationality. Unlike Putra MCAGA, Putra Melayu, here they use the term Malayan nationality. But there was no champion after that, because Dato' left UMNO because of the conflicts within the party, and formed the new party, the Independent Malaya Party, and that's the end of that proposal. Now, so the question is, what was declared on Merdeka Day, 31st August 1957? In the Merdeka Declaration, there was no mention of Malaya, but Persekutuan Tanah Melayu. There was no mention of Malayan nation, but a free, independent, and sovereign nation among nations of the world. Now, you can read that in the Peristiharaan Kemerdekaan or Merdeka Declaration when you have the time. So, and the approach taken after independence towards ethnic diversity was to promote inter-ethnic tolerance and accommodation, but not creating a national identity out of diversity. And the slogan used was unit, bersatu bertambah mutu, which means roughly unity will make our quality better. Now, the economic framework was laissez-faire. Growth was left to the market. So also was distribution, but this model failed to address the second challenge, which I'll touch on just after this, and that led to the May 1969 riots. Now, what was the second challenge? The second challenge was the historical socio-economic imbalances. Now, this was dealt with yesterday in the paper on the new economic policy by Prof. Han, so I will not go into details here. But just to recap the points here, there was extant poverty along class and ethnic lines, extreme uneven distribution of wealth amongst ethnic groups. There was also between locals and foreigners, namely the British, who owned the overwhelming proportion of the assets in the country, equity in the country. And also there was sharp disparity between regions, especially between the West Coast and the East Coast. Now, there was also the ethnic identification with occupation that has got to be removed, and this was done through the restructuring of society. And both challenges, especially the second challenge, have to be addressed through the social engineering of the NEP. And a completely new paradigm of state intervention in the economy was adopted to replace the earlier laissez-faire model, and that marked the beginning of the developmentalist state in Malaysia from 1970 or 1971 onwards. Now, I just would like to emphasize that the NEP came with a package. The package consisted of 6 components. One, the new form of governance. At that time, the emergency, suspension of Parliament, National Operations Council on May 17, 1969 until February 1971. Second, there was the setting up of the National Consultative Council, which was in January 1970, which was a deliberative council, which consisting of 67 prominent individuals. Through their deliberations, Rukun Negara was created, which was supposed to create a new national consensus, this was launched on 31st August 1970 by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. The third was the new economic model to replace the laissez-faire model, which is the NEP, which is state in the economy, and the nature of the state was developmental state. And if you look into history, there was an important speech by the Prime Minister, the second Prime Minister Tun Razak, in Murid on July 25th, 1971, in which he talked about nationalist socialism. And to him, the NEP, more in one way or the other, embodies that kind of concept, the nationalist socialism. Number four, as part of the package, that there was a huge need for qualified, well-trained workforce with knowledge and skills to address development, and also to address inter-ethnic relations and to build unity. And there was a big emphasis on science and technology, but at the same time, social sciences and humanities were emphasized, and social subjects in the social sciences like sociology, anthropology, political science, psychology, and so on began to be introduced in the universities in the form of departments and faculties were being set up then in 1970, 71, and so on. Fifth, there was a coalition government set up between UMNO and PAS, and then the formation of the Grand Coalition, an extension of the Alliance Party to become Barisan Nasional in January 1974. So people use it as an example of consociationalism. And this is to address the intense multi-party political competition and ethnic bickering, in order to diffuse the ethnic tension. Now, number six, which has not been much discussed about, is that in Razak's speech in Parliament on July 11, 1971, when he tabled the second Malaysia plan and the new economic policy, he enjoined the members of Parliament and the people of Malaysia to work towards a just and equitable society, and that Malaysia should strive towards a progressive, modern, and united Bangsa Malaysia. This was not very much highlighted in discussions on the NEP and Razak's positioning on the issue. So I'm including this as part of the package of the NEP, the sixth component of the package, which is going to be the central issue in my paper today, the Bangsa Malaysia. Unlike the first five measures which I mentioned, the sixth, the concept of Bangsa Malaysia, was not debated and not developed into policy. Why? This is anybody's guess, but presumably it was assumed that Bangsa Malaysia would be able to evolve through the forging of unity as enjoined by the Hukum Negara and by the new economic policy, and perhaps also through social mobility and occupational restructuring of society with the breakdown of the Pernivalian ethnic enclave, and that would lead to some kind of intermingling of the various ethnic groups. Now, if this was the thinking and expectation, this obviously would be rather naive, because forging Bangsa Malaysia, as we have seen over the last 50 years, will require more than just that. It was very complicated, it's been very complicated. It will require a change of mindset and psychology, and acceptance and acceptance of and identification with a new national identity besides one's own ethnic identity. Now, that is the two challenges at the time of independence right through until the 1970s. Now, the second part of my presentation will focus on social cohesion and national unity over the 5 decades. Is basically to assess briefly the impact of the NEP on social cohesion and national unity into ethnic relations and so on. Now, of course, NEP was a strategic plan for nation building with the overriding objective to achieve national unity guided by the Hukum Negara. But as I indicated earlier on, Bangsa Malaysia did not become the focus. And even then, even unity is still a problem. And after 50 years, there is the National Unity Plan, which has been crafted and launched in early 2021. Now, what about social cohesion and inter-ethnic relations and unity over the last 50 years? I can briefly summarize that there have been two tendencies over the last 50 years. One is that social cohesion, stability, cooperation, and cross-ethnic solidarity prevail. That is the main trend. Second, the other trend, the counter trend, is that there have been tensions. There have been ethnic bickering, especially since the 2000s, and to some extent, even ethnic polarization. Now, the fact of the long rule of UMNO BN over 60 years contributed to stability, yes, but it masked the tensions and dissatisfactions. And the tensions became very intense and very open after UMNO Barisan Nasional collapse in May 2018 and the rise of Pakatan Harapan, a multi-ethnic coalition. But as we all know, Pakatan Harapan only lasted for 2 months and then taken over by the Malay-based coalition of Bersatu, PAS, and others. Now, the NEP success, with the NEP success, there was stability and cooperation among ethnic. The NEP, with the state as the engine of growth between 1971 to 1985, and from afterwards, Mahathir changed gear, but with private sector driven growth. And researchers like Donald Snodgrass regarded NEP as the most ambitious affirmative action program ever undertaken in the developing country. And he argued that that development, that ethnic heterogeneity need not necessarily be a problem, an obstacle for economic development, given the right recipe and the right policies, approach, and so on. In fact, Malaysia did very well over the 20-year period. Rapid growth and development. Malaysia was among the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world, averaging between 8 to 9% during 1988 to 1995. And Malaysia was part of the so-called Asian miracle, as mentioned by the World Bank. Now, that is one thing, but there are other things that can be highlighted as an outcome of the new economic policy, which was the rise of a multi-ethnic middle and corporate classes. In the main, the rise of the Malay middle class, which is very clear, very noticeable, especially since the late 80s and the 1990s, and also the rise of the corporate classes. And such rise led to Mahathir talking about Malaysia, Melayu Baru in 1991-92. Then we have the rise of the civil society. Expanding civil society increasingly become very assertive, champion of democracy, etc. But at the same time, the rise of civil society groups was accompanied by also the rise of the uncivil groups. There was also the sense of confidence and success. There was a pride of Malaysia being on the world map, the sense of pride in being part of Malaysia. And then, of course, you will remember the slogan Malaysia Boleh in 1992, which reflects the confidence at that time, which was the spirit of the age at that time. In fact, the slogan was not top-down. It was created by the sports community, because at that time Malaysia was hosting the Thomas Cup and the Uber Cup. It was the rallying call for them to boost up the spirit of sports people and also the supporters and the spectators, but that it was adopted by Mahathir. But besides stability, there was also tension. But what contributed to stability? The one view is that economic success. The normally silent acquiescence was because of the change to the neoliberal policy after 1986, which was welcomed by them. There was the role of developmentalism, which is an argument by Francis Lowe. Developmentalism is the ideology of development. People were engrossed in development, so to speak. But developmentalism did not extinguish ethnicity. At best, it pushed ethnicity into the private domain for a while, so quiet for a while. But at the same time, there was genuine pluralist acceptance of the other, of cross-ethnic solidarity, of building bridges, crossing divides, and so on. This is at the macro level. And a number of studies done at that time, in the late 20th century, 1999, 2000. These were the findings that I was involved in one study on the culture of pluralism, and I think Francis himself also involved in such studies as well. And at the same time, at the macro level, macro developments, we have, of course, the reformasi, the birth of the reformasi, which was multi-ethnic. Malaysia as the majority, but it was multi-ethnic. And then, of course, we have Bersih, the movement for clean and fair election, which was multi-ethnic. And during the Bersih rallies, if you remember, during some 12, 13, 14 years ago, that many people in the rally said that they could feel that Bangsa Malaysia is born on the streets of Kuala Lumpur. Now, there were a number of recent studies that highlight the positive developments, but at the same time does acknowledge the existence of tension. The 5 surveys on ethnic relations, surveys conducted between 2010 to 2017. These surveys were summarized by Liu Ho An in their paper in 2017. And the findings more or less confirm what I just said, that Malaysians generally relate well across ethnic lines, show goodwill towards each other. There was broad multi-ethnic support for a shift away from ethnicity-based politics and political parties, increasing interaction and friendship that fosters better understanding. But at the same time, many of them do, in terms of the circles of friends, tend to be ethnically homogeneous, but sometimes this cannot be avoided. But it has not completely broken out of that ethnic boundaries yet. But in terms of attitude, they were cross ethnic. That is one finding. Now, second, the study, the surveys also asked questions regarding Bumiputra preferential treatment, and the respondents were quite divided on this, with a majority in favor, but minority unhappy, seeing that as unfair. And to the question, are race-based policies still relevant today? 38% yes, 48% said no. But the interesting thing is that among the Malay respondents, it was evenly split, 42% agreeing with the race-based policies, and that they are still relevant, while the other 42% disagreeing with it. Among the Chinese respondents, of course, the majority, 60%, disagreed with it, 28% supportive among the Indians, similar pattern with a percentage of 52 against and 54 agreeing. Now, the most recent study is done by last year, which highlights one point, that times of adversity brings people, irrespective of their ethnic groups and religious backgrounds, closer together. And if the evidence is during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Gerakan Bendera Putih or the White Flag Movement, with the tagline "Kita Jaga Kita," setting up food banks, the mutual help assistance, the counseling, etc., etc. And that one we can see recently, last year and even this year. And then a survey done last year, an online survey conducted between July and September of covering 751 respondents, shows, we affirm that, yes, during the pandemic, people were closer together. And then on the question of Bangsa Malaysia, they said that 86% of them said that they were confident Malaysians will work together to build a united Bangsa Malaysia. Okay, but there is the other side of the coin. I will just quickly run through this. Many of you know this, but just to recap, to refresh the memory. Incidents of tension and polarization, like for example, 1987 situation that led to Operasi Lalang, and then 2001, the Kampung Medan riots, and then the so-called hotspots in various parts of the country. And then among university students, there were claims of polarization, resulting in the ethnic relations module being introduced in 2007 to teach among students in the 20 public universities. And then in 2008, the election in 2008, the BN suffered tremendous electoral setbacks. It lost its two-thirds majority in parliament, its conventional two-thirds majority in parliament. And UMNO blamed it on the Chinese voters, calling it the Chinese tsunami that led to the UMNO losing its its conventional two-thirds majority. Of course, and then at the same time, in 2007, we had the Hindrat movement demanding rights for the Indian community, and then the Malaysian mentality discourse of othering the non-Malays, the term of pendatang and so on was quite strong at that time. And then in May 2018, with the collapse of BN, UMNO and BN, and PH coming into power, constant attacks on the PH government, especially the DAP, alleging them as undermining their rights and even religion. And then the Malay Unity Congress in 2019, in which the chief organizer declared that Malaysia belongs to the Malays. So in other words, the situation, whilst there has been stability, there has been in the main stable, harmonious relations, we have a situation to the tendency towards polarization, etc. Now, what was the reaction of the government under Najib at that time? Najib set up the National Unity Consultative Council in September 2013, and which was seen as an effort of national reconciliation to reduce racial polarization and building a united Malaysian nation. Now, this NUCC was a replication of the National Consultative Council of 1970. The mandate of the NUCC was to prepare a blueprint for national unity and social cohesion to replace the outdated Sedition Act of 1948. And NUCC made recommendations to legislate 3 harmony bills to tackle discrimination, criminalize hate speech, and set up a National Harmony Commission to deal with ethnic and religious tensions. All those were good proposals, good moves, good measures, but did they materialize? This did not materialize under Najib, and it also failed to materialize under the Pakatan Harapan government and under the PN government. It did not take it up at all. Instead, under the PN government, we have the National Unity Policy launched in January 2021. Now, what about Bangsa Malaysia? Let's quickly move through this, which is to recap, okay, historical imbalances addressed. Of course, there were problems, but challenge 2 is the question of the nation. Do we have a nation, Bangsa Malaysia, or a state without a nation? Okay, just to recap that the Bangsa Malaysia was not just the wish at the top, articulated from the top, but it's also the wish from below. And you can see this in the poem written by Osman Awang, dedicated to his close friend, Dr. M.K. Rajakumar, written in 1980s. And he was very upset with the term, with the dichotomizing of Bumiputra and non-Bumiputra. And he said here is that the gap pulling us further apart, I am called a Bumiputra, while you are not. And then the last stanza in the poem was that when would all citizens enjoy the same rights and justice, being recognized with a common name, Bangsa Malaysia. The translation is mine. The Malay version is on the left, as you can see there, which was by the author, by the poet. Now, so in other words, Bangsa Malaysia is not just from the top, it's also from below. Now, Bangsa Malaysia is often associated with Mahathir, but as I said just now, he preceded him by 20 years at least, because Tun Razak made that call in 1971. But in 1988, Mahathir made a speech about membina Bangsa Malaysia. The details you can see there. And that was a prelude to his Vision 2020 speech, which he made on 28 February 1991, in which he said that to be a developed nation by 2020, we have to address 9 challenges, and the first and foremost of these challenges is establishing a united Malaysian nation with a sense of common and shared destiny. So this is all well known. So I just recap here in order to refresh our mind about it. Now, but there are difficulties and challenges of Bangsa Malaysia as a concept and also as a policy implementation. Some observers, like Mr. Ishaq, say that can it be reconciled with the competing ideologies, ethnic ideologies of a nation, or would it further complicate the politics of Malaysia? And even Rustam himself, who was one of those thinkers behind Bangsa Malaysia, felt very unhappy about it. That, according to him, when he wrote in 2008, that political events in Malaysia during the last few years have convinced him that Malaysia was just a state without a nation, or at least a state with several competing nations. At the Mahathir in January 2021, he said that we still distinguish ourselves as being Malays, Chinese, and Indians, and we don't have a Bangsa Malaysia. That's Mahathir's conclusion. But as I said just now, Bangsa Malaysia is also a conception from below, from among the people, from among the writers and some intellectuals. It's evident in the 1980s in the Reformasi and Persih movement, cross ethnic solidarity, and as I said, they regard that Bangsa Malaysia was being born on the streets of Kuala Lumpur. In the 1990s, there were forums on nation building and Bangsa Malaysia, books and articles written, and there was a lot of excitement to link Bangsa Malaysia with Vision 2020 and so on. And then in the 2000s until 2017, the surveys indicate there is a desire for Bangsa Malaysia. So now, what next then? Policy-wise, the champion of Bangsa Malaysia in his Vision 2020 said that there is no Bangsa Malaysia. But so as I said just now, among the people, there is a desire for Bangsa Malaysia, and of course there are those who oppose it. So by way of conclusion, what policy options do we have, and where do we go from here? Let's from 2004 onwards, and more so since 2009, Bangsa Malaysia as a political national identity has not been given emphasis. It seems to have been sidelined and on the margin of discourse. And you can see this Bangsa Malaysia missing from policy documents, for example, in the 12th Malaysia Plan 2021-2025, under the heading Vision 2020 and appraisal, it refers to the first challenge of establishing a united nation with a sense of common and shared destiny that Mahathir mentioned in his speech, Vision 2020 speech, but this part did not refer to Bangsa Malaysia at all. What about in the National Unity Plan 2021? The document lists various policy documents on unity, but not Vision 2020. No Bangsa Malaysia. That in the section Pillars of Unity and Strategies, pillar number 2 for national identity, there was no reference to Bangsa Malaysia. It talks about national identity, but what kind of identity? I mean, do you have a nation? Do you have a Bangsa? It doesn't say anything on that. And then in the Shared Prosperity Vision 2030, chapter 3 is entitled The Nation State, or Negara Bangsa in Malay, but there was no direct reference to Bangsa Malaysia under that title. Bangsa Malaysia was referred to somewhere, but not very conspicuous. So it is not very visible. Then, of course, the latest, Tarisha Yo in her welcoming speech just now mentioned about Keluarga Malaysia. Keluarga Malaysia is the tagline of the 9th Prime Minister Ismail Sabri, which he announced in his maiden speech. Whilst Keluarga Malaysia projects the name of Malaysia, but regards the Malaysians as one keluarga, one family. But it is not a national identity. It's not about political national identity that we are talking about. And there's no attempt to link it with Bangsa Malaysia. So the keluarga will promote Bangsa Malaysia as our national identity. It's just about Keluarga Malaysia. So why is this? Maybe one can say that leaders would like to have their own conception and their own political tagline to be left as their legacy. For example, after Mahathir, we have Abdullah Ahmad Badawi with Islam Hadari. We have Najib with one Malaysia, and of course we have Ismail Sabri, the present Prime Minister, with Keluarga Malaysia. So this is understandable. I mean, we can see, looking at it from the psychology of the leaders, of course it's understandable that they want their legacy. But the point is about nation building, about the future of the country. So based on all this, we can see that there's no champion among the political elite for Bangsa Malaysia. Now, moving into the future beyond 50 years of the new economic policy, what options do we have? I put here on the table 3 options. 1, should Malaysia continue with the situation of being a state without a nation? A situation that we started with at the time of independence. Is that the way forward? Or should Malaysia continue with the situation of being a state with competing notions of the nation based on the various identities, ethnic, religious, regional, etc.? Or thirdly, should Malaysia develop a new national consensus to work for a state with a united Malaysian nation, with a national political identity, with a nation called Bangsa Malaysia? Now, maybe there are other options, but to me, it appears based on the survey of the last 50 years or so, these are the 3 options that Malaysia has to choose. Now, I put here just for discussion, can we reframe the discourse on Bangsa Malaysia, on the enduring values of the new economic policy and economic negara, and new methods and strategies? The enduring values of economic negara and the NEP is about unity, democracy, justice, a liberal approach towards diversity, that means open-mindedness, acceptance of diversity, and of course progress based on science and technology. And such discourse, reframing the discourse and make it quite central is necessary to prepare the psychological conditions for an open mind on Bangsa Malaysia and the way forward. And through that, then we can find out, do people desire it? Or are they indifferent to it? Or are they against it? And to find out answer to that question, to find out an evidence-based answer to that question, perhaps it's timely that a nationwide survey on Bangsa Malaysia is undertaken, which will be some kind of stock taking. Through such survey, you can identify the gaps, the points of contention, the points of resolution, etc. Now, the alternative discourse or reframing the discourse has to be based on evidence gathered from the ground, whether the people want Bangsa Malaysia as the national political identity, or they want to remain as they are, with a state without a nation in the real sense, and so on and so on. Now, if people want it, how many of them? What is the proportion who want it? And who are they? Is it desirous among the young and not so among the older generation? Now, if we can get evidence that answer these questions, then perhaps the discourse for the future of nation building can be more grounded and more evidence-based, and perhaps that can impact upon policy making. I think that's all I have today. And if it is the young that answers yes to that, then perhaps you can focus on schools and universities and the youth association. And but the challenge is complicated. But people may ask, why do we need a national identity, a nation? The point is, besides our ethnic, religious, and region-based identity, we need a national identity to identify with and feel a sense of belonging, sharing a shared destiny and future. This is an imperative for a nation. But as I said, it is a big challenge, it's complicated, etc. And the question is, do we take a presentist or short-termist view and regard Bangsa Malaysia as a no-go, especially now with various tendencies of Bangsa Johor in Johor and in Sabah and Sarawak with regional sentiments and some tendencies of separatism, especially with the distraction over the Malaysia Agreement 1963. And James Shin talked about Borneo exit. Later on, he may want to explain on that. Or do we take a long view of history and the history of ideas approach, that a good idea will survive the challenges, will remain in the wings, and could become mainstream again when conditions prevail? We have to see the sentiments of the young, the identification intact. I think that will be the way forward to base ourselves on evidence. Okay, thank you very much, Yashin. So over to you.
Thank you, Prof. If you could just stop sharing your screen, then I will pass the time over to our MC for the day, Wan Yashin.
Okay, I've stopped now.
Thank you so much, Prof. Wan Yashin is the Acting Research Director at Ideas, and she will be our moderator for today. Over to you, Yashin.
Thank you, Vaishnavi. And thank you, Prof, for the insightful and very comprehensive presentation. I think Prof has talked about how NEP is a strategic plan for nation building with the overriding objective to achieve national unity. So Prof has also demarcated the impact of NEP on social cohesion into 3 periods, which is from 1971 to 2008, where generate episodes of tension, but still with general atmosphere of peace and social cohesion due to rapid development and rising prosperity. Then he talked about the second period, where 2008 until February 2020, which is a period of rising ethnic and religious polarization and tension. And from February 2020 onwards, with the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, how any relation seems to have stabilized again. And Prof has also talked about how nations are not merely a product of envisioning of the state leaders, they are also a product of how people interpret their experiences. And throughout the years, he has analyzed and expounded on how Bangsa Malaysia has been envisioned by the leaders, but how has it also been sidelined throughout the years in policy making, and how different leaders have taken different political branding instead. So rather than focusing on the building of Bangsa Malaysia, attention has been on the dichotomizing of Bumiputra and non-Bumiputra, which has the othering and splitting consequences. And it's also one of the unintended consequences of NEP. So as a result, the Rukun Negara objectives have not been fully achieved. So, but we do see an opportunity in COVID-19 and in the rise of more solidarity among the people. And so what maybe this is the time we can talk about how does are there new opportunities to rebuild the nation? Are there new opportunities to come together to think about what does Bangsa Malaysia means to us? And can we move forward from here and reconcile and talk about how can we come together as one nation? Yeah, so I would like to introduce our first panelist of the day, which is, we have 2 esteemed panelists with us besides Prof. Rahman, which is the first is Netusha, and the second is Professor James Shin. So I will introduce Netusha first, and then after that, followed by Professor James Shin. So Netusha Naidu is the president of Imagine Malaysia, a non-profit education project aiming to broaden understanding of Southeast Asia, specifically Malaysian history, providing a platform to learn and critically discuss alternative historical narratives. Through this work, she strives to advance the role of public history in social policy, peace building, and national integration. Netusha recently completed a Master of Philosophy in World History at the University of Cambridge, funded by the Tunku Abdul Rahman Fund, and previously a Bachelor of Arts with Honours in International Relations at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Netusha is also a member of Forces of Renewal for Southeast Asia, also known as FOSSE. Yes, over to you, Netusha.
Hi, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank Ideas for inviting me to respond to Prof. Rahman's paper. It's quite an honor having read, many of your papers, Prof. And of course, alongside Professor James Shin, who I've had the pleasure of speaking with prior to this for our Tanpa Perkauman and Anti-Racist History of Malaysia campaign, with ideas. And James has really helped us to look through and examine, especially how we approach the issue of separatism and national identity in Sabah and Sarawak. So yeah, and of course, thank you everyone for being here and spending your morning talking about something really, I guess, really complicated, as we saw in the paper presentation just now. And there's just a lot to digest, right? And I think like the timeliness of this discussion is here. I just wanted to share like the anecdote. Just recently, I attended Professor Wang Gungwu's lecture for the 4th Syed Hussein Alatas Memorial Lecture in National University of Singapore. And during his lecture, he shared stories about being at the front lines of this kind of framing of what is the Malaysian nation post-independence, and how he looks back now at this like what seems to be a very uncritical space, and the need to like move forward in terms of how we think about nation. And at the end of his presentation and the Q&A section, Professor Wang Gungwu ended up just saying that he actually does not believe in the concept of a nation state or working towards a kind of like national identity. Instead, he said that the future of the world is to actually reject the concept of nation states, and because in his idea it's completely fiction. So I think like that is where the debate stands as today, and a lot of it's compounded by the inequalities that have come to bear because of the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine apartheid being like a major issue that really shows like this like decline in the ability to compound ourselves and like constrict ourselves within like a very Eurocentric idea like the nation state. So that's probably where I would focus my critique of this question, right, about Bangsa Malaysia. Is there any hope for a concept that comes from a nebulous shell of like colonial categories? And what is our role as like the new generation or young generation of Malaysians who may be more aware and critical of the fact that colonial categories of race, or in this way I'm paraphrasing Sumit Mandal's opening of his book Becoming Arab, where he talks about how many scholars are uncritically reproducing very essentialist ideas of race as they're putting forward their critique. And what is the future of talking about race relations in a way that we can reframe it so that we actually don't give so much power to this and actually free ourselves? I think for me, the first step is definitely confronting the real issues at hand. It is one thing to like say we want our governments to like come up with fluffy, pretty looking like policy papers, which they do keep doing, and wanting to like define and flesh out what is that vision of a nation. But how can we truly know that this is like what everybody wants when there's one, the issue of trust deficit. Two, as we can also observe, you know, Prof. Rahman gave us this really extensive timeline of policies and initiatives, right? But we also witnessed like the active and very coordinated erasure and suppression of like the issue of discrimination in our society, right? So can we actually really materialize and think about concepts of Bangsa Malaysia if we ourselves at all levels, you know, from a societal level to like institutional, can't even grapple with confronting racism and eradicating discrimination in our everyday social interactions? That is the main purpose of Tanpa Perkauman's campaign. You know, we create all these resources, because ultimately it's not just about looking into the past and learning about different ways of how to conceptualize nation, but it's also that the fact that the future of nation, or like social cohesion, but I don't really like the word social cohesion. I think it's very artificial, but more like resilience, right? We're trying to build a resilience of society. It's really contingent to the fact whether we actually like can personally question and interrogate our everyday interactions and move beyond racialized thinking. And I think this was like really beautifully captured in Sumit Mandal's paper on trans-ethnic solidarities. I saw some of the points kind of resonate with Prof. Rahman's paper as well, where he talks about, in the conclusion that colonial era racialization, which I do feel like, we're still living in the shadow of that, a lot of these like arrangements or lines of thinking. Just the difference is that obviously we have neoliberal capitalism in the picture, framing a lot of this and hardening racialized thinking. But it doesn't completely reflect our social realities, as Prof. Rahman also like pointed out very clearly. So instead, like something that he pointed towards too, and also in his recent presentation, which I had the privilege of responding to the paper by Pusat Sejarah Rakyat, 3 elements are important in this conversation. How can we include elements of mutual empathy? That's one. Inclusion, and third, equality of identities in these conversations to reframe our understanding of diversity, ethnic diversity. Because as far as we are concerned, and we see throughout this entire like pattern or timeline of managing Malaysian society, is that race is positioned as a problem. And where does that come from? The colonial period. So how do we move forward from race being the center of the problem that needs to be solved, right? And there's also this other point which I think is worth like having an honest conversation about, because we need to reevaluate this like multiple levels of social, political, economic interactions, and where we like need to question, interrogate, and try to turn over and eradicate race. I think that one of these excellent points pointed out was in Amita Malhi's paper about the National Harmony Bill. And in that paper, there's one particular point that stood out, because this is something I also think about a lot. As Prof. Rahman said, adversity brings us closer, right? But there's also this idea that I think she called it scandal cycles, where race becomes like a point of crisis for like political change or turning point. And when there's like when we're about to go somewhere more progressive, do you realize that suddenly like bam, there's like a scandal? For instance, like the ratification of ISET, right? ISET could have been very beneficial as a framework to address discrimination in Malaysia. But what happens? So there's a statement or any kind of initiative that questions this very ethno-nationalist like understanding of like our society. If it's considered pushing the boundaries of acceptability, because it's questioning like Malay hegemony ultimately, and not just Malay hegemony, it's Malay capitalist hegemony, then there's going to be a big media scandal. Then everyone starts to like argue, fight. It attracts attention from all facets of society, right? And as she said in that paper, that it irreversibly shifts public policy debates and outcomes signaled by each provocation. So ultimately, what happens at the end is that we don't actually have any real substantial conversations, or TLDR, too long didn't read, like a millennial thing. But anyway, like in short, like how Toni Morrison says, right, it's racism is ultimately the distraction. And it's still a distraction. And I do think that this idea of like wanting to keep thinking of how to frame nation is also a form of distraction from the foundational problems, which is, discrimination and addressing and correcting discrimination, right? Maybe I sound too practical, I'm not sure. But as a young person and growing up in a very racist society and being a victim of racism at every level, I'm sick and tired. And as a historian, I think like I'm trying to incorporate that in my work and to Imagine Malaysia's work. So ultimately, like then also we observe in Prof. Rahman's paper, something that Shaharuddin Maruf noted in his paper, his book Malay Ideas on Development. He talked about how Malay capitalism is sine qua non for peace and good race relations, right? So like whatever, and this kind of connects every time we need a scandal cycle, we need like a crisis to come in and to justify and reinforce Malay ethno-nationalist and capitalist rule. And this is a big part of the resiliency of the government, ruling coalition, and like our political structures. So ultimately, I think like as a young Malaysian, my question is, why can't our politicians attempt to break those scandal cycles? Why do they not take an active role in trying to redirect conversations and try to evolve and transform our political culture to move away? And I think that's where the real work needs to start. And it needs to end. And all this cop-outs about, I'm the only one who thinks about it. One day we'll have a mature conversation. Oh, it does not allow for that. I'm just one person, I can't do it. No, that's not good enough. And, we deserve better, the young generation of Malaysians. So that's kind of where I'm going to stop. And I hope that I look forward to Prof. Rahman's response, Prof. James Shin, especially like the fact on how much resentment and unresolved grievances there are in the communities of Sabah and Sarawak, and real substantial problems, right? Statelessness is one, right? And lack of access to resources for upward social mobility. This is something that affects many of us. So I'm going to stop there and looking forward to the rest of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Netusha. Maybe just pass over to Prof. Rahman to make some response to that, like maybe a short one to what Netusha has said, or passing on to James.
Oh, I would rather hear from James first before
Okay,
my
sure.
response.
Yeah. Let me introduce our second panelist. Professor James Shin is a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania and was an inaugural director of the Asia Institute Tasmania. He is an expert on the governance issue in Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. Before the University of Tasmania, James was the foundation head of the School of Arts and Social Sciences, Monash University, Malaysia. James is a senior fellow at the Jeffrey Chia Institute on Southeast Asia, a senior visiting research fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and on the international editorial board for the Journal of Current Southeast Asian Affairs. His views are regularly sought by major news agencies around the world, including New York Times, the Financial Times, BBC World, and Bloomberg. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start off by thanking IDS for the kind invitation for me to say a few words about NEP and 50th anniversary of NEP. And I'm very pleased to be in this panel because I was very pleased to hear that my good friend, Professor Rahman Embong, has actually written this portion of IDS 50th anniversary look back at the NEP. I think Professor Embong has written a very, very good paper. It's very comprehensive, and I think it covers a lot of areas. And I think his paper is actually a very good place to start a conversation about this whole idea of NEP, the whole idea of national identity, and this idea of Bangsa Malaysia, and whether it is possible for a country like Malaysia. I would also like to bring in my co-commentator Netusha which I think represents the voice of the young people. I think the sort of issues she raised is essentially the sort of issues raised by the younger Malaysians as they grapple with this idea of Bangsa Malaysia. The big difference between third generation and people of my generation is that they grew up in the era of NEP. Basically, they grew up in the era of NEP touches on every facet of Malaysian life. And this idea of Bangsa Malaysia, as Professor Rahman has reminded us, was an idea that was picked up by Mahathir. He was selling it for a while. Then when he realized that it was not effective, he dropped it immediately. I'm not going to add on a lot of stuff because I think a lot of things that I wanted to say has already been spoken by Netusha. But I just wanted to bring up several key points, which I think should be added if we're going to have an honest discussion about the NEP and national identity. I think one of the key reasons why the NEP is such a difficult topic to deal with is that there were actually a lot of supporters of the NEP. Professor Rahman talked about the survey done on, among the Malay population, but that is just one part of the picture. The real picture of happening at NEP is that at the elite level, there's actually a lot of elites from all ethnic groups who are actually strong supporters of the NEP. Now, the reasons I said that, and I think a lot of people will be surprised when I say a lot of Chinese groups support NEP, is because a lot of them actually made a lot of money from the NEP. They actually do not want to replace the NEP. The reason is very simple, right? With the NEP, government procurement, all the major infrastructure projects, and you will always have the NEP component of the Bumiputera agenda. Now you have to ask yourself, once you carve up all these big projects to the Bumiputera component, who is going to benefit for it? It will be the Malay elites, but they are not the one doing the jobs. They are the one who has joint ventures with the Chinese tycoons, with the certain Indian tycoons. And these are the people who need the NEP in order to keep their business afloat. Without the NEP, a lot of these businesses have to compete openly in the business world. And I suspect a lot of them actually do not have a model for operating in the normal business world. Their entire business model is based on the NEP. They go to the government and say that, we want 70% of this project because this is the Bumi component. Now, I can give you a very, very simple example of how this elite approach towards NEP, right, can actually derail anything you want to do in terms of reforms of NEP. Now, the key line is 2008. As mentioned by Professor Rambon, in 2008, the Barisan Nasional lost two-thirds majority. Shortly 1 year after that, they got rid of Patla and they brought in Najib Razak. Najib Razak, despite all his faults, immediately understood that we need to reform the Malaysian economy and we need to reform the NEP. So one of the first things he did was to set up a NEAC, a National Economic Council, and he brought in a lot of experts who really knew what was happening in the Malaysian economy. And one of the things they spent a lot of time and resources on was how to reform the NEP. So if you read the part one of the original report, not the final report, the original report, basically the report asked the Malaysian government to get rid of the NEP and replace it with something else. That was deemed unacceptable to the Malay establishment. Najib tried very hard to sell this idea to the Malay establishment by saying that if we get rid of NEP, replace it with something else, over the long run, it will be better for everybody. That, of course, did not happen. Huh? The pushback was so strong, Najib was forced to back down. And in the end, the final report that was published was basically saying that we just need to go to new areas, but we keep the NEP. So that's an example of why it is so difficult to reform the NEP. Secondly, I think the issue of national identity and national unity, I think we need to sort of compartmentalize it and say that on the one hand, you got all these academic studies, all these surveys saying that people like the idea of Bangsa Malaysia. But the people who take part in the surveys are not the one who actually decide which way policy will move. I think the reality is that there are certain things in the Malaysian political system that makes national unity of Bangsa Malaysia impossible with the current institutional structures, right? And I'll just go through a few, right? The first, obviously, is that, the ideology of Ketuhanan Melayu, it is still very strong among all the mainstream Malay parties. Okay. And this is really inconsistent with this idea that, that Malaysia is a diverse place. Bangsa Malaysia says that everybody has a place in the sun. This ideology of Ketuhanan Melayu basically says that the Malays are always number one, everybody else can be 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's inconsistent with this idea of Bangsa Malaysia. Secondly, if you look at the structure of political parties in Malaysia, right, for the longest time, all the political parties that preach diversity, multiracialism has not succeeded. The parties that actually push to champion one single race or one single religion, these are the most successful parties. So that's the reason why this model works for them, and they keep reinforcing it, racial approach and religious approach. Another area which I think would impede the creation of Bangsa Malaysia or national unity is, of course, the rise of political Islam. This is something that was not addressed in Professor Rahman's paper, but I'm sure he's well aware of it. This has major implications because their view of Malaysia is very different from what everyone else is thinking. Okay? Those people who keep pushing for political Islam or use political Islam as a platform, basically the view is a similarist view of Malaysia, which I suspect a lot of the non-Malay communities in Malaysia will reject. And this comes back to the earlier point I made about difficulties in trying to sell a very good idea. The idea may be good on paper, but it's very difficult to sell it in real life. And I think Netusha also alerted us to that. And finally, my final point is, and this is mentioned already, which is the East Malaysian version. The East Malaysian version is completely different. Even the way they talk about Bangsa Malaysia or national unity for the East Malaysian side, the narrative is completely different to all the discussion on the Semenanjung side. So I think I'll stop here. I just want to make one more point, which I think is a really, really important point when we discuss this, which is that one of the major divides in Malaysia, right, besides the political side, is actually this whole issue of the economic system that we live under, capitalism. Capitalism and social media, interestingly enough, are actually used as very, very powerful tools to divide Malaysians more than ever. And the reason why they're being used as this tool is because the elites or the Malay establishment or the Malaysian establishment, consisting of the non-Malay elites as well, right? These are the people who control the capitalism system we have in Malaysia, and they've latched onto social media to divide the people further. Without dividing the people further, basically, they cannot hang on to their influence, their power, and their resources. So ironically, in some ways, even though Malaysia has embraced capitalism, part of capitalism works in such a way that it actually destroys any chance that we can actually have some form of national unity in Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Yeah, before I pass to Professor Rahman, maybe could you elaborate more? I think you talk about how the East Malaysian version of Bangsa Malaysia is different from the West Malaysia. Could you elaborate further on that?
Sure. So I think this idea of Bangsa Malaysia, if you look at it from the Semenanjung perspective, right, it is about bringing all the different races together. In more recent years, it's about bringing the Malays and the non-Malays together. In the East Malaysian mind, right, from day one, right, they don't have this idea of bringing people together. Because the unique thing about East Malaysia is that from day one, even before the formation of Federation of Malaysia, is that there was never one ethnic group that constitutes a majority, right? So everyone grows up with this idea that our society is always plural. There's no such thing as domination. And that the idea of so-called Bangsa Sarawak or Bangsa North Borneo or whatever is all about acceptance of other people, because you're always mixing with other people all the time. So very early on, you're exposed to this idea that, that you yourself are not unique. You will always have to rely and work with other people. So this is what I mean when I said their mindset is completely different. Here, when you talk about Bangsa Malaysia, if you ask the ordinary people in Semenanjung, right, immediately the thing that comes into their mind is the Bumiputera, non-Bumiputera dichotomy, the Malays, non-Malays, Islam, non-Islam. It's basically, sort of a two-horse race or two issues race. But in East Malaysia, I can tell you, the people over there don't have this sort of mindset. Their mindset is completely different because of the demography and also because of their culture and their history. As you know, right, Sarawak was ruled by a private family, English family, for more than 100 years. And in North Borneo, it was ruled by a private company. So it's a very, very different kind of mindset. I think one of the big damages done by the British colonial administration was that they imported this idea basically from India and Myanmar, this idea of divide and rule, right? And of course, it was so successful in this part of the world that they exported to places like Fiji, Suriname, and all over, other places. Because it's a clear distinction between the way the British ruled the colonial empire, say compared to the French in Indochina. So it is very clear that a lot of things we see today, whether we like it or not, a lot of it is also due to colonial legacy. So I was really pleased that Professor Rahman has managed to weave that into his narrative, at the end of the Second World War, all the different groups, including the communists, come together to create the idea of new nation. But my point is that I'm sorry to hold a very pessimistic view. I'm saying that there are institutional barriers you need to overcome before you can even talk about this whole idea of national unity. And my point is that if you don't deal with this elite stranglehold on Malaysian politics, I think a lot of this discussion will end up, as discussion at the academic level.
Thank you, James. Yeah, I think both James and Netusha also talk about how moving beyond race and also acceptance being like the core to having a more cohesive and also reconciling the different ethnic groups. Yeah, over to you, Professor Rahman. Do you have any thoughts and ways to respond to what James and Netusha has said?
Thank you, Yashin, and thank you to Natasha and also to James. As I've said in my presentation, the NEP is a very, very complex question, very complicated and difficult to handle. And this can be seen from the responses from our two panelists that yes, it is indeed a very difficult question to handle, but we have to handle it nevertheless. I think there are several points made by both panelists, which I just want to highlight. I don't have much time to tell much. I think what Prof. James Shin said at the end, that the unique thing about Sabah and Sarawak, they never have the experience of one ethnic group dominating the others, and their conception of society is always plural. And that kind of thinking is definitely different from Semenanjung. But I think that kind of thinking is something that we have to study deeper, and the strength of that kind of thinking is mutual acceptance of the other, and this has been seen and demonstrated by the various groups in Sabah and Sarawak. I think that is one point, and that can be the basis for further discussion about Bangsa Malaysia. The second point is about the institutional barriers and the elite entrenchment. So much vested interest they have in maintaining the kind of structures that they have today. Yes, definitely that is the elephant on the table that has got to be addressed if we want real change. And I didn't touch on it because that was touched yesterday, but I can see that in the discourse, in the discussions, that the reluctance to move beyond. I mean to talk about Bangsa Malaysia now in the policies is partly due to this. That it is not in keeping with their interest to have an open discussion or discourse on the subject, is in order to keep intact what they have. But I do agree. Yes, we have got to put institutional barriers on the table. We have got to put the vested interest of the elite on the table if we want to move beyond the 50 years of the NEP. Now, the third point I would like to just say briefly here. How much time do I have for Yashin?
Yes, you still have time. Please go
Okay.
on. Yeah.
Okay. Is what has been raised by Natasha. Congratulations, Natasha. Yes, I like that because as a young person, you voice your views in a forthright manner, and a spade is a spade. And I think that's what you need. And I agree with you that the issues of discrimination, of inequalities, of racism are real, and this has got to be tackled. I mean, any policies that don't address this will just perpetuate what has been going on in the last 50 years or even longer than 50 years. Um, and and uh, and it is an offshoot of I mean, these are what do you call it, the unintended consequences of the long policy of the NEP. Discrimination anywhere, people, I mean, so I suppose, I don't know, I haven't read the bill, the proposed bill that was supposed to be tabled during Naidu's time, but I do not, and I do not know whether this issue of discrimination was taken up or not. But I think that this is a subject that can be deepened further as we go along, and in what way Malaysia's way forward. If the discrimination continues, how can we remain a cohesive, united nation society if we don't deal directly with the issue of discrimination? Yes, I agree with that. And the campaign of Tanpa Perkauman is a good campaign. I agree. It's good, but it is not an easy campaign because there'll be obstacles, just like we see the obstacles of Bangsa Malaysia. But it has got to be done, and I think it's good that the young people are picking it up. That tanpa perkauman, which means that treat everybody as a human being, not based on your ethnic identity or religious identity or whatever. But if you are a citizen of the country, a human being, and therefore don't discriminate based on kaum or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the gist of what tanpa perkauman is. Now, I think there is a distinction between the colonial racial categories and the concept of nation. Unfortunately, in Malay, the word bangsa is a bit, it can stretch either way. It is in Malay, it is taksa, which means that it can mean kaum, it can mean nation, it can be main race in bangsa, in the word bangsa itself. Though in English, the term nation is quite clear. Now, when I use the term Bangsa Malaysia, I do not mean race. I don't mean Malaysian race. I know the former chief editor of the Straits Times called it Malaysian race. I think that is wrong. Yes, race is a category in the Bansi, in the census created by the colonialists. But Bangsa Malaysia is not a category created by them. It is an attempt at redefining the people of diverse ethnic groups into one political entity, into one political identity. If they so wish, you can have only one Bangsa Malaysia if the people want it. If the various generations of the people want it. But that does not fall under the category of the categorizations by the colonialists. It's different. It's not an ethnic-based category, just like the term Melayu, as proposed in the constitutional proposal of Prof. MCJ. It is not based on race. It is not based on blood or non-ethnic origin, but it's based on patriotism. And in a similar manner, Bangsa Malaysia takes that cue as well. It is not a racial category. Now, the other point is that you refer to Professor Wang Ganggu's lecture on nation building. I missed that lecture. I would love to listen to it. But the gist of what you have said, that you paraphrase Professor Wang, that the future, according to what Prof. Wang, as you reported, is that it's not nation states. It is a fiction. I don't want to comment based on I don't want to comment on that. But I would say that the era of nation building in Malaysia, Southeast Asia is still there. When that future, when nation states are no longer relevant, I don't know. It may take many, many decades, many, many years, many centuries, perhaps. But Europe said that before. When in the 60s, when I was a student in the UK, when we talk about nations and nationalism, they say, no, we should be talking about internationalism. But they are going back to nationalism now. Ethno-nationalism, in fact. Ethno-populism and all that. So I don't think we can wish away nation states from existence until a certain period. So for the moment, we have to live with it and to define it in a ways that perhaps can suit the purpose of overcoming discrimination, the purpose of promoting pluralism, mutual respect and acceptance of the other, instead of we keep othering the others. Why not including everybody, the others? I think that kind of discourse should be on the table. And I don't think we should put forward the idea that nation state will be a fiction, because it will not, it is a real thing at the moment. It may become fictional later on, I don't know. So, but the content of it, I think it matters, because get rid of discrimination, get rid of inequality. But how to do it? Of course, there are institutional barriers. Of course, there are vested interests. They are very well entrenched to ensure that it cannot happen. But we have got to move on. And then on the question of Bangsa Malaysia, I put towards the end of my presentation, what really is the thinking of the people? Do they want it? Or or is it just a figment of the imagination of the leaders and those people who think that that should be the way forward? I think it's a good thing to assess that by asking the survey. Now, James mentioned that those people who participate in the survey are not the policymakers. Correct. But at least we have the evidence, what they want. And then when these people talk about evidence-based policy making and all that, and perhaps with that kind of evidence, then we can say something that this is based on what people want. And policymakers have to take note of that. And the point is about politicians is that they are very short-termist, and they have got a 5-year perspective. The worldview is of 5 years, the next election. But we have got to live with this beyond 5 years. It's beyond generations. So how should it be? I mean, if we remain, we have a state, but if we think that Bangsa Malaysia is not the answer to that, then what kind of solution should we have to address the people? I mean, the content of it is, of course, we have got to address discrimination, inequality, but we have lived over 60 years or at least 50 years with that kind of institutional structures and also with that kind of thinking framework. And now we have got to address that. To bring about change, that thinking framework to wean people away from that kind of idea to accept the new idea is a very tough task. I mean, this is one of the things said yesterday's session, weaning people from the what do you call that, the clash of those ideas and to accept the new ideas, the alternative discourse and so on. Okay, yes.
Yeah. Prof, yes, I think in your paper you mentioned about intersectionalities of identities, that Bangsa Malaysia is one of the political identities that can coexist with the other ethnic identities and other identities that one has. Would you want to share more on that? I think that's the important point of how Bangsa Malaysia is one of our identities. It might be a salient identity. It might not be to some people as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Yasin. Yes, identities are fluid, identities are multiple, and if they intersect at certain levels or at certain points, you can be a Malay, but at the same time you are a Muslim. You are also assume a state-based identity, Bangsa Johor, for example, uh, gender identity, and so on. But and for women can be single mothers is also an identity. Um, Youth generation identity. So it intersects at some points or other. But I think the Bangsa Malaysia, which is a national identity, does not negate the various types of other identities, because I mean, people remain with their identities, whatever their identities are. But in terms of the country, in terms of the nation, then what are we? We are not. Well, we are keluarga Malaysia lah. I mean, according to the latest, the latest tagline, we are part of keluarga Malaysia. Yes, but that's not an identity in that sense. It's not a political identity in that sense. It's quite an easy way. I mean, it's harmonious. It doesn't create controversies. Yeah, but Bangsa Malaysia creates controversies because there are so many contestations to it. But I think multiple identities, intersections of identities are not at loggerheads with the national identity of Bangsa Malaysia.
Maybe Netusha, do you have anything to comment to that? Respond to.
Okay, well, I think like maybe like a part of where I'm coming from is because I think that Bangsa Malaysia is like, and this kind of like interrogation about wanting to build national identity in a society that is like so complex, and there's a lot of like oppressed and vulnerable communities that are actively being excluded, and we enable like, and I think that Bangsa Malaysia and this idea of forming Malaysian identity is predicated upon the violent exclusion and erasure of people who do not fit into that category of being Malaysian. And this includes Malaysians born on this land, because I mean, like, they're born on this soil, but they are not considered Malaysian because, one, they don't have a paper saying that they're Malaysian or ID card. And there could be so many reasons for it. Some of it is for sexist, patriarchal reasons, as we learned in the recent court case pushed forward by Family Frontiers. And this government had tried to actively like also exercise patriarchal violence, right, in this situation. Then we have refugees who are, coming to this country as a result of forced migration, and because they feel that this is a Muslim majority country, therefore like it is their best option here and safest. But are they really safe? I don't think so. And we can get anecdotal evidence for how difficult their life is. We have issues of indigenous people in the depths of like the forest frontiers, or living between or people living between the borders, right? And all this movement of undocumented migrants and whatnot, we just like leave them unaddressed, but they are so salient. And I think that we've just become so desensitized to like how much violence has taken place on this land, and how blood-soaked all of it is. Testimony, Wang Kelian is one of these issues. Where does the issue of Wang Kelian and mass graves in Wang Kelian stand in like an issue like Bangsa Malaysia, right? This is what I mean by the need for like very tangible like confrontation with the overt violence. And that is where like what are the things we need to deal with. policing, the disproportionate number of Malaysian Indian men dying in custody. But it's a problem that we all share. It's not just specifically to Malaysian Indians, right? Deaths in custody is not an issue that needs to be entirely racialized. But why I say there's a disproportionate number of Malaysian Indians. Why can't we deal with all these issues and take them seriously? And before we can, and I'm not saying that it can't, this needs to be dealt with first before we discuss nation, right? But it has to happen at the same time. Otherwise, you're going to have a pathetic budget allocation like this recent one. I have to say, having listened to it and reading the entire budget allocation, it's embarrassing. I felt there's no other word for it besides being disgusted, angry, and feeling like I've been sucked into a portal and gone back into this past, monochrome past of very overt racism and essentialization. And the fact that it can continue replicated by the highest powers with very little accountability and opposition that is a strong, salient opposition is very concerning. We are not making enough progress on in the sense of building social cohesion, national unity, simply because we are not actually actively sufficiently in the widest capacity to do this. And that's where I think would make this conversation and pursuit for national identity more relevant, in the sense that the preoccupation, right, with this needs to come from a place of praxis as well, rather than just also thinking about looking into the past to inform that praxis and correct the historical injustices. So yeah, that's where I think I would stop.
Yeah, so it's more about, if I understand what you're saying, is that addressing the underlying issues of why we couldn't have that kind of cohesion and unity of racism, discrimination, addressing those underlying issues first before we talk about how to have that kind of national unity. So maybe we can move on to one of the questions, I think, from the floor, maybe to James, on this question on impact of what we have talked about a little bit on the lack of national identity. How does it attribute and impact the Malaysian performance in terms of economy?
The short answer is that it has never really impacted on the economy. I think I like what Professor Rahman Embong said just now. I think the reality is that Malaysians, right, even throughout the years of the NEP, throughout the institutional racism built into the system, right, all of us has always held multiple identities. So this is very clear when you see Malaysian students coming together when they're outside Malaysia. They always call themselves Malaysians first, but the moment they land back in KLIA, suddenly, they have a separate identity. So I think all of us have this multiple identities thing happening at all times. But coming back to your question about the impact of identities on the economy, the short answer is no, it doesn't really impact on the economy. The unique thing about the Malaysian economy is that for the longest time, the Malaysian economy is basically a state-run economy. I know it's a terrible thing to say. People always think that we are living in a free economy, but if you look at the statistics, if you look at even Bursa Malaysia today, you look at the 10 largest cap, 9 are actually GLCs. So the government has always taken a very big stake in the way that the Malaysian economy has worked. Where identity is important is probably at the symbolic stage. So for example, the head of all GLCs, all the large companies, as much as possible, they want to appoint a Malay person. or a Muslim person to lead that organization. But as far as I know, in the business world, in the private economy, right, talent really does count. If you can do the job, you know, you will get hired. You may not be in the #1 position in the GLC, but again, that comes back to the earlier point when I talk about institutional structures. Those things are placed there to reinforce a certain view of Malaysia. The people, the elites in this country, they want Malaysia to represent a certain views. So this is where we've always had this issue of what does Malaysia mean to you? If you ask different ethnic groups in this country, even people of different ages, they will tell you very different things about what Malaysia is. This is of course not unique to Malaysia. Singapore has been grappling with this country question for years. Indonesia, same thing. So most countries around the region, because of the way the boundaries were drawn at colonial times, this issue of identity has always been there. But I think in the Malaysian case, what is unique is that how much this is driven by the elites in this country, how much it is cemented in the system, that all the other voices are sort of pushed apart. And this is where, I talk about, that's the reason why my last comment just now was on capitalism and how new technology and social media are being used to shape our ideas of what this Malaysian identity is. And my take is that capitalism, the way it's structured in Malaysia is not very good for us in terms of national integration, national unity. And that new things like social media is used to divide rather than bring people together.
Are there any successful national unity that you have seen in other countries? This is a question from the floor. So James.
I'll let my good friend Rahman get my good friend Rahman to answer.
Okay, sure. Prof. Rahman, over to you.
Is there a good model of
Yes.
national unity from other countries?
Other countries.
Is that's a question, right? Well, let's put it this way. There is no ideal model of national unity from anywhere. A seemingly good model has got its own drawbacks. For example, like Indonesia, which has got a nation since 1928 under Sumpah Pemuda. I mean, in the main, they have got a national identity. But of course, there are problems of minorities, of religious groups, etc. Of those in the provinces, you have see it like Aceh, you have got Papua, I can't remember what they call it in Indonesian. But you have got that problem. Okay, let's take Thailand. Thailand similarly appears to have national identity, but there are problems in the south. They've got Muslim separatism, etc. Look at China. 55 ethnic groups who come as the major dominant ethnic group of over 90%, and they give autonomy to the various ethnic groups, and for certain regions they have got the special arrangements like Hong Kong, Macau, and all that. In the main, they manage that quite well, but of course there are voices and struggles among the ethnic minorities, especially in Xinjiang. I mean, there are various reasons. There are issues of terrorism, etc., etc. But the world outside, especially the West, talk about genocide and all that. But I think you can't point to a perfect model. But what about the West? The West, they say that Switzerland, which is multilingual, but it has got to depend on its history that leads to that kind of creation of a model. England, Britain, there are problems with Wales, with Scotland, etc., etc. So there isn't. So we are not looking for a perfect model, but we are looking for a workable model, where in the main you can overcome and and discriminate against. I mean, you overcome discrimination, you overcome inequalities, but those take respect human rights, etc. I mean, this is the gist, I think, of what Netusha was saying. These issues of human rights, when you're talking about refugees, you're talking about people on the borders without statelessness, etc. So if the state takes care of those things, then I think that's why in my paper I said how people perceive the treatment of the state towards them, that matters a lot. And that affects unity, the sentiments toward unity, towards affiliation to the country, etc., etc. And some people may feel that they don't belong here, they want to leave. So it matters a lot. If the state is enlightened and implement in reality, not just in rhetoric, the question of anti-discrimination, address inequality, respect for human rights, for gender rights, for ethnic rights, etc., etc. I think that sets the first precondition for forging a national identity that can be in the main, not all, in the main acceptable to the various people. But I think some of the things that Netusha raised will be discussed, I think, tomorrow on the question of indigenous groups, etc. But coming, yes. I just want to say, can I just have a minute? Because I want to respond to James on the issue when he responded to the question.
Yes,
whether
sure, go ahead.
National identity will have an impact upon the economy. I think whether, well, is the economy stupid, right? I mean, in that sense, because the economy does not firstly respond to national identity, but the economy responds to good policies. Whether the policy is good or not, will bring profit to them or not. And whether it is open, transparent, competitive, whether there is rasuah or not, I mean, corruption or not. I mean, I think that matters first. And then, of course, the other things matter too. Because if ethnic identity or national identity does not contribute towards merit, then they are concerned. But I think the first thing is the openness of the system, of policies, whether the policies are favorable for economic development and growth, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Netusha, I think you have a comment on the same point.
Yeah, I do actually. I do agree that there is no perfect model, but we can definitely see that there are individuals and groups that actually are working towards building solutions and interrogating statehood in ways that are being they're actually challenging the existing order. A lot of this can be found especially in the United States, which is not a perfect country. It has a lot of issues, and compounded by the fact it's a settler colonial state, obviously, right? But here's the thing, we have so there's just so much of resources, and that is a lot of what was foundational to Tanpa Perkauman or pioneering anti-racist work in Malaysia. That's people-centric and oriented towards practical, tangible steps towards addressing discrimination. And I think the fact that there is that room to explore and to create all these manuals and toolkits and resources that are free on the internet, and you have a variety of thinkers, scholars, and activists in the US working on this. This is something that we lack in Malaysia. Not only just the kind of expertise, but also a kind of political will. And it's not about how intellectually capable they are, but it's a lack of political will because too many people benefit from the existing structures, particularly the ruling elite, right? And another point I think which is a bit unpopular that I want to make here, and its relevance because another way to look at this whole issue of statehood, I think, is that I think Prof. Rahman made an excellent point about this renewed principles and terms and conditions, right? Or basically a new social contract, word that's very distorted in the Malaysian context. So basically that's what it is, right? But nation states, in my opinion, and from my study of the whole idea, I kind of take on a bit of Tongchai Winnie Chakul's idea here. Siam map, which is that, I think every nation state model is basically essentially settler colonial in its logic, including Malaysia, because there's always a constant need to even as we talk about inclusion, exclusion needs to happen. And we're constantly in the process of dispossessing and outlying because we are still using the same political mechanizations. And I think it's like a really huge undertaking for us to really like rethink. And that's why I think like what some of the anti-racist work that is going on in the US by these groups and collectives. And I recommend definitely starting with Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist, as a starting point, and then going further and exploring like more of these concepts. And we need to like get to work. And I mean, in Imagine Malaysia's case, and with ideas, we are getting to work already, right? So but yeah, and of course, like I need to signal boost architects of diversity here. And we are currently running like this workshop with 40 amazing students between the ages of 18 and 25 who are the next generation of Malaysians who are going to do this work. And we are equipping them with those skills. And Dr. Lee Hoak On will be joining us in a couple of weeks, and as well as Dr. Ananti Aramya. So, I think that all hope is not lost, but definitely we need to like, there's definitely need a way to change the way we are doing things. And I think that's the way to move forward. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a suggestion from the floor as well on the Singapore model, talking about Lee Kuan Yew opted for unity by identifying all ethnic groups as Singaporeans. What are your thoughts on this, Prof. Rahman, and maybe other panelists as well? Prof. Rahman, you're muted. Yeah.
What is it?
The Singapore model. On the Singapore model, what do you think about the Singapore model in terms of uniting the different ethnic groups as Singaporeans?
The Singapore model in terms of advancing its economy to become an advanced, developed economy within a certain period of time is something. Now, regarding the model of unity among the various ethnic groups there, I think that there is something to learn from it, especially and is it a Chinese dominant or dominated state, or is it a state which recognizes the rights of the different ethnic groups? Well, I think it is not a Chinese dominated state, though Chinese are the majority. I think that's one. Then the policies in the main appear to be acceptable. But there are certain things that has got to be looked into. For example, the question of positions in critical institutions like the military, the police, etc. So some are acceptable. Some I think have got to be looked at more critically. That's my response.
I think just to move on to, I think we have been talking about all the racism and discrimination, and also some issues of having a nationhood and a state as well, and national unity. So just coming back to what Prof. Rahman has highlighted about COVID-19 and how there's an increased solidarity during this time, where I think James also talked about social media and how that has impacted social cohesion and also national unity. James, would you like to talk further and comment on this in terms of the impact of social media and how it has changed national unity during this time, especially like during COVID-19?
Sure, but I think given the time constraints, I just want to talk about the way forward. I think the reality for the Malaysian situation, as I mentioned, we all have multiple identities. I think the important thing is that the state must be neutral when it comes to the issue of national identity. We basically need two things. We need sort of a great minimum national narrative of what Malaysia is. And after that, the state must be neutral. I think one of the reasons why we can't agree to a narrative of what Malaysia is and what it means to be Malaysian is because the state is widely perceived and behave as working on behalf of the Malay community or the Malay agenda. The reality is that if the state is neutral, in other words, the state doesn't take any sides, then I think a lot of the issues of the national narrative and what it means to be Malaysia will resolve by itself. Because I think at the core, at the very core, right, at the minimum, everybody understands what Malaysia is. Because when you travel outside Malaysia, you carry a red color passport. You are Malaysian. You may be from Selangor, maybe from Pahang, Sabah, but it doesn't matter. But there is such a thing as a Malaysian. I visited a lot of countries. I'm sure you've been to a lot of countries as well. Malaysians always get together, right? They may disagree on the politics, but they'll come together, do a potluck or whatever. So there is a minimum base for creating this Malaysian identity. The reason why this thing cannot move forward is because the state does not take a neutral approach to this identity. The state is trying to impose its view of what national identity is, and that is based on the ethnic criteria and economic benefits and other benefits attached to this ethnic criteria. And increasingly, they're imposing an Islamic or a religious identity to the Malaysian identity. And because of that, you get reactions from the ground up for people who disagree with this view of what Malaysia is. So if the state is neutral, then I think a lot of the issues that we discussed in this panel discussion this afternoon, a lot of it will be resolved. So I think, yes, there is such a thing as being a Malaysian, but the state itself, its view of how a Malaysian is or what Malaysia is, it is skewed in such a way that a lot of us disagree with it. So that's the reason why we are questioning this idea of national identity.
Thank you, James. Yeah, maybe to Netusha, what do you think are some of the ways that we can reconcile and also to move forward in terms of having national unity?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I actually really like what James said just now, because that's what but to get to the point where building it's a whole theoretical conception in itself, the neutral state, right? And what would it take to reach to the point of a neutral state? Would it require revolution? This is maybe stage theory might answer this as a question. So but peace-loving people do not want revolution. So what are the other ways of transformative action that can take place? Most certainly, I think our our ongoing program with the students, Akaumbi Kita, is a prime example of how we can move forward and start really instead of just as James and Prof Rahman also mentioned, we have so much disagreements about what is it that entails Bangsa Malaysia or Malaysian national identity. So I think that programs like this, building the capacity to think and voice and articulate, to write, to conceptualize in new ways would definitely be the steps we need to take. Looking to the past, as even yesterday's webinar, Prof Jomo mentioned this quite very eloquently, and we see that history has a place in all this, and history combined with the tools for transformative justice and utilizing these anti-racist resources to fit the Malaysian context, that's definitely where it's headed, and we should be headed, and we must push forward. Holding our politicians more accountable, definitely we need to do that more, call them out. And yeah, that's where I would end. And that's also my conclusion from this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Netusha. Yeah, I think in view of time, I think James need to go in a few minutes. Maybe James, do you have any concluding remarks before I pass it back to Prof. Rahman to talk about our way forward?
So my conclusion remarks is that I think this sort of open discussion, I think, is extremely important. I think we need to hold more honest conversations, not only among the so-called Bangsa crowd, but I think it's important that this sort of conversation is held across throughout Malaysia. I think the reality is that if you were to hold this conversation in Kelantan or you hold this conversation in Johor, whatever it is, right? Very often the conclusions you come up will probably be very similar. And that I think most people at the end of the day, most rational people at the end of the day, they want the state to be neutral, I think, at the end of the day. It is true a significant portion of the people do benefit from the NEP and the Bumiputera policy. But at the end of the day, right, they do understand that that policy has too many contradictions. It is not gonna lead Malaysia anywhere. A very, very simple thing can tell people is that, if you talk about keeping the Bumiputera system forever, right? Right now, approximately 70% of the population will get quote unquote a free meal. In about 30 years' time, you will reach 80%. I mean, do you want a situation where, in the future, right, where the country itself cannot afford these sort of policies anymore, and that everyone will pay, So I think if you have this sort of conversation, especially among among the whole population of Malaysia, I think is a really good thing, because I think very often, right, people in this country, they don't think, they rely on the social media to tell them how to think. And if they're not part of the conversation, they don't start thinking. So what I find is that when I talk to people, right, you put them on a spot, you force them to think, and usually, despite what everyone says, I can tell you, usually the conclusion is actually quite a rational conclusion. So thank you very much. And I'm really, really pleased to be part of this panel. Congratulations, Professor Rahman, on a really good paper.
Thank you, James, for your insights and contribution today. Yeah. Maybe now we pass to Prof. Rahman. Any thoughts on how do we move forward? How do we reconcile, and how do we enhance the national unity? And maybe you can unpack some of the policies recommendation that you put forth in the paper as well. I think there are some steps that you have put forth.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I will be very concise. First, I agree with what Prof. Shin said just now, that there's this kind of conversation have got to go on, and it shouldn't stop here. And open, rational, evidence-based, and principle-based discussion or conversation, building a new kind of narrative about our nation on the way forward, I think is very important to move beyond what we have just done. That's number one. Number two is about, I mean, at the core of it is the role of the state. Yes, I agree with that. Can the state be neutral, and not just be neutral, be just, democratic, enlightened? Can it be so? Well, I think the answer is for those who hold the levers of power to answer that. But there are many issues there. But the point is that there is the wish, there's our desire that the state should be neutral on issues of identity. It has got to be just. It has got to be democratic. It has got to be enlightened, to ensure that citizenry, whatever identities they belong to, enjoy the benefits of being citizens of the state. I think that's number two. Number three is the people themselves. I mean, how to bring about pressures on the state so that they act and behave in the way that they should behave, that citizens want. I think the active citizenry through civil society and other means is very important, and they have got to come up to say what they want, to say what they think, and to say so rationally and in a civil manner, so that their voices can be heard and be taken note of by the leaders and by those who hold the levers of power in the state. And number four is that the young people, and I'm happy that we have a young people, and not only just young, but also a woman in the panel, Netusha, is good. And we need the voices of the young. to come forward. I mean, the views that I have in the paper is too detailed to come forward. I mean, to say here. But the point is that I suggest towards the end about Bangsa Malaysia, why not we do some stock taking based on evidence, a nationwide referendum, if you like, you want to call it that way, to way forward for the next 50 years. We have come already 60 years or 50 years. Why not have a referendum? Because in the beginning it was just said by the top. Why not let the below, the people, say their views through the referendum and to stop taking that sense, and then we can be very sure about what they want and how their specific identities can jive in with the national identity. On that note, I would like to say very much, thank you very much again to Ideas. Thank you to both of you, to Prof. James, long time no see, and to Netusha for your comments, and also the questions from the participants, which we didn't have much time to deal with, but nevertheless, I think Ideas will share their comments and questions from the participants to me and to the panelists as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Rahman. Maybe to Netusha, any concluding remarks to the audience?
I think I'll just reiterate that, the conversation is complicated, but definitely a more people-centric, action-oriented approach to accompany like this, my headphones low battery, to accompany, the critical thinking and intellectualizing of like the state, and the possibility of like the neutral state is very interesting and something that we should explore in our context. But yeah, there's this work that is coming along and developing, anti-racist work in Malaysia, and it's just the beginning. And yes, please follow Imagine Malaysia and our current campaign with Ideas Tanpa Perkauman. And I think that we are making progress in the sense we are able to even have this conversation openly and critique violence and these like different like variations of violence and how to like overcome them, so that we have a much more resilient and more united society. But yeah, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's a true privilege to be, I guess, a non-professor between two professors and having this conversation. So yeah, thank you, Ideas.
Thank you, Netusha. Yeah, thanks. I think the conversation has been really about having an honest conversation about what it means to be a Malaysian as well, right? Everyone has their own experiences that we need to share with one another, and about the neutrality of the state as well in enhancing and ensuring that the building of Bangsa Malaysia actually comes into fruition. Thank you everyone for your time today, and I would like join me to thank our panelists today, Professor Rahman, James, and also Netusha, for their insights and contribution throughout the discussion. It has been wonderful to have all of them with different diverse backgrounds and also diverse opinions and different generations as well. I think that is really the kind of conversation that we should have. It's not just about differences in terms of ethnicity, but also differences in terms of region, in terms of others, in terms of generation as well. Thank you all for your time, and I will pass this time over to Vice Navi.
Thank you, Yashin, and thank you to the wonderful panelists, and to Prof. Rahman. Congratulations on the publication of your paper. Please do join us again tomorrow as we wrap up this project with one last webinar looking at the contesting Bumiputra identity among Orang Asli and the indigenous people of Sabah and Sarawak. If you would like to download the full version of Prof. Rahman's paper, you can visit our website at ideas.org.my. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.